Hey guys, Candice Malcolm here. We are live. It's Friday evening, Friday afternoon, depending on where you are watching from. So thank you so much for tuning in. There's a lot to talk about. I typically on these broadcasts, I'll only talk about one topic, but there's just way too much going on. I couldn't choose. So I'm going to try to go through a whole bunch of different topics here in the next half hour or so. So I'm going to wait for a few more people to jump on. Why don't you let me know where you're watching from, where in the world you are this Friday afternoon, Friday evening, and if there's anything specific that you want me to talk about, just go ahead and let me know. We tried something new yesterday. My colleague and I, Andrew Lawton, we did a double live broadcast, which I think went pretty well. I think there was some audio issues going on, but otherwise it was good to go through basically all of the, we touched upon all the different terrorist attacks that have been happening over the last couple weeks. So if you haven't already, check that out. I'm going to wait just another minute or so longer to wait for some people to jump on and watch this broadcast, and then we'll get going. People have been letting me know where they're watching from. Let me know where you're watching from. Wow, someone's watching from Whitehorse, Yukon here on Facebook. Someone from Midland, Ontario. We have a couple of Americans watching on Periscope and Twitter. So right on, I'm broadcasting simultaneously on Facebook and on Twitter. So Twitter links to Periscope. So, all right, let's get going here because I do have a lot that I want to cover. It's busy news week up here in Canada. And yeah, so I think probably the top story of the week was the fact that Omar Khadr was back in the news. Omar Khadr, as everyone knows, is a confessed convicted murderer. He confessed to the murder of Sergeant Christopher Spear in an Al-Qaeda or in a Taliban sort of shootout that happened in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. He spent quite a bit of time in Guantanamo Bay, and while he was there, he kind of became the poster child of sort of he was created this poster child of mistreatment of American power and the sympathetic Canadian that was being held there, to make it seem like it was really the U.S. was at fault. Of course, Omar Khadr is the son of a high-ranking, high-level Al-Qaeda operative who was a financier, close personal friend of Osama bin Laden. He was considered at one point to be the top Al-Qaeda operative in North America. And he really raised his family to be horrible ideological jihadists. The family spent most of their time in Afghanistan and Pakistan during the 80s and 90s. They would fly back to Canada to have their children. So their children were born on Canadian soil, and then they would fly back with their family, getting bigger and bigger, to doing all these crazy operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They always claimed that they were doing sort of peacekeeping stuff and charity stuff, but they weren't. They were terrorists. And basically, Omar Khadr was 15 years old and got caught in this gunfight. He threw a grenade that he confessed to, killing the sergeant, killing the Army medic, Christopher Spear, and blinding another medic or another soldier that was there. Anyways, the story has sort of been well hashed. I've written extensively on it. I have a long essay in the Weekly Standard that I wrote a couple years ago on exactly what went down. So check that out if you want all the details. I'll just say he's back in the news this week because he wanted to get some of the conditions of his bail release. He's now free. He's in Edmonton. He was released. And then, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave him $10.5 million in the summer of 2017 as a sort of compensation for the fact that the Canadian Supreme Court found that his rights had been violated while he was in U.S. custody. Somehow that was the fault of the Canadian government. And so Trudeau decided to pay the guy. Now he wants some of the conditions of his bail extended. He wants to be able to travel freely to go to Saudi Arabia, and he wants to be able to talk to his sister, who is also a very extreme individual who's had lots of run-ins as well, not to mention the fact that, in interviews, she's talked about how 9/11 was justified, how she defended terrorists. She defends terrorists time and time again. Pretty horrible person. And, the whole interesting thing is that Khadr always said that he's not like his family, he's nothing like his family, so we shouldn't judge him based on his crazy terrorist family. Fair enough, but then why is it that he wants to be able to visit them and talk to them unsupervised by Canadian security agents? I think that's fair game. So as per usual, Canadians know this routine. We've seen it time and time again. This is like a super divisive issue where some people just feel very strongly that this guy was an innocent victim in this whole thing. He was a child soldier is what they call him, which is pretty insulting to the actual concept of child soldiers. But anyways, I won't get into that argument. People in Canada have a very strong opinion about this issue. You either think that he is a horrible person, a terrorist who deserves to be like thrown away and throw away the key, or you think he's an innocent victim and sort of the poster child of American brutality. The state broadcaster in Canada, the CBC, takes one side pretty blatantly, and they think that Khadr is a victim. So here's a perfect example of this. This is a CBC journalist, a reporter, I should say, who's supposed to be non-biased, who's supposed to be presenting and covering the news, not having a biased opinion. This is what he has to say yesterday about Omar Khadr. If I can get this to play, which was just playing a second ago. Hold on one second. So this is the CBC, typical sort of deference to some of the worst people in the world. Let me just change my internet now. Here we go. Here we go.
Yeah, I'm sure something the Liberals don't really want to be answering questions about. I'm sure something Andrew Scheer is happy to keep raising, because this has been something that the Conservatives have used quite aggressively since it happened. But, I want to pull back from the Khadr thing. And before I moved to Ottawa and became a parliamentary reporter, as a local reporter for the CBC in Newfoundland, I spent a lot of time in court. And when you're covering provincial court, you see a lot of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds coming through in shackles and handcuffs. And then, it's routine stuff. It could be vandalism, it could be drugs, it could be violence. And when you pull back and listen to the story, these are kids that didn't have a chance, often because of terrible parents who put them in terrible situations when they were young. And Omar Khadr kind of falls into a situation like this. He was 15, taken away, rules about child soldiers. I know Rachel's might have a very different opinion on this. But we're in a judicial process now, and just like we were before. And I think, don't politicize judicial processes. We just talked about China, people being seized for political reasons and not having their rights and not respecting the rule of law and all the issues that creates.
He was asked, to be fair, Mr. Scheer was asked.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
That was basically the crux of what I wanted to point out. He basically just says Omar Khadr is just like these 15, 16, 17-year-old kids who he encountered in the court system in St. John's, Newfoundland, who, got arrested for vandalism or maybe, drug crimes or whatever. There's no distinction between, in this guy's mind, between kids that get into like petty crime in their teenage years and a person who went and fought alongside the Taliban and Al Qaeda. It wasn't just that one gunfight that Omar Khadr was involved in. He was also, there's extensive video that surfaced of him building IEDs, building bombs, planting these roadside bombs, laughing away, having a great old time with his buddies in the Taliban. And yeah, sure, he was 15. He was a couple of weeks shy of his 16th birthday. And we all know that the court systems often treat people in that age group. They treat them like adults. They get adult sentencing. Anyways, the whole idea here is that, these kids just all have bad parents. So just like some kids in St. John, Newfoundland that had bad parents, Omar Khadr just had some bad parents and bad family members. And so how can we really blame him? And we shouldn't politicize the court decision. I mean, that's a pretty, I think that's kind of like the typical moral relativism at the CBC, like a convicted terrorist who killed at least one U.S. Army medic that we know of. His bombs that he planted could have killed many, many more, not just soldiers, but also civilians and families in Afghanistan. We know that the kind of IEDs that he was planning killed 97 Canadian servicemen during that war. To draw that equivalency is kind of sickening, and it kind of hurts their own argument, like we should just let the courts decide and we shouldn't politicize this argument. Well, if you are saying that the whole point of Omar Khadr being painted as a victim and painted as some kind of a child who was brainwashed and indoctrinated, then you have to admit that it was his family that put him in that situation. It was his crazy parents. It was his terrorist-loving family, particularly even his older sister, who had a great influence on him. And so the very thing that Omar Khadr is asking for is to be able to spend more time with his family, spend more unsupervised time with his family. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't both say he was a victim of an evil family and then also say, so we should let him spend more time with that evil family. That's the thing about Omar Khadr. Every time he, every few years he reappears in the news, making a whole new list of complaints and demands. This time is no different. He's talking about his life in Edmonton, with $10.5 million from the taxpayer, freedom, the ability to just live his life in Edmonton. That's not enough. He said that not being able to travel to Saudi Arabia and not being able to talk to his sister makes him feel like he's still in Guantanamo. Makes him feel like he's still in Guantanamo, which makes me think that Guantanamo Bay wasn't really that bad. Because if you're free and you have this cash payout and you can pretty much live a normal life, and you still feel like you're in Guantanamo because you don't have these little things that you want, well, again, Guantanamo couldn't have been that bad. And you give this guy an inch, he takes a mile. It's pretty despicable. Another story that was in the news, it's just horrifying and sad. A Canadian baby was killed this week. His pregnant mother was shot in the stomach by a Hamas terrorist on Sunday night. Basically, a group of Palestinian gunmen approached a bus stop in Ofra, which is outside of Jerusalem, and started gunning down a group of Jews. It shot 7 people, including a 19-year-old woman who was 8 months pregnant at the time. Her husband is a Canadian citizen. He's Canadian. He was also shot. They rushed this woman to the hospital, basically did an emergency C-section, delivered the baby prematurely. Doctors worked on keeping this baby alive for 72 hours straight before the baby finally died, tragically on Wednesday. And basically, the baby was buried. There was a huge funeral service in Israel. Thousands of people have attended. And the Israeli police force basically, through investigation, found 5 men that they thought were responsible for this shooting. They went in to arrest them. Some of the men tried to flee. There was a shootout between Israeli forces and these Hamas operatives, or these Palestinian gunmen. One of them died. The other 4 were arrested. And as soon as that one gunman died, the propaganda machine in Palestinian circles just started, ramping up. And so they were disseminating their posters, calling him a martyr, calling him a hero. This is the same kind of stuff. It's completely typical over there, that if you're a Palestinian who kills a Jew, you're treated as a martyr. If you die trying to fight against, the Israeli forces, in any way they consider you a martyr. So there were Palestinian posters circulating. An official Palestinian Twitter account posted a picture of the terrorist with his own young daughter, evoking that image of him with children, as if to say, that these people care about children, when he literally just killed an unborn baby. I shared this already on Facebook and Twitter, but this is the official account. This tweet is still up. For all the people that Twitter deletes and censors and tries to shut down, if you are a Palestinian account, the account claims to be Palestine's voice to the world, then you get to post a picture of a terrorist with a child, calling him a martyr, and saying that the rough translation here is that he used bullets against the occupation this evening. So, if you celebrate the killing of a preborn baby as fighting against oppression, against occupation, if somehow you think an unborn baby represents occupation, somehow represents a government or a military, this is just the most despicable kind of thinking imaginable. They get to post their stuff on Twitter, no problem. That's just one of the examples. The stuff's all over the place of these Hamas operatives celebrating the death of a baby that hadn't even been born yet. And, again, this is just one case, one example. It's particularly sad. not just because the baby was Canadian, or the fact that they go after a baby, but the fact that Hamas kind of just does this stuff routinely, regularly, and doesn't get international scorn and condemnation. The example is that just last week, the U.S. had a motion at the United Nations to condemn Hamas for their terrorism, for their violence against Israeli civilians, and the United Nations Assembly of member states voted against this motion. So the motion did not pass. So the world community had an opportunity to condemn despicable acts of violence and terrorism against civilians, and they didn't bother. I mean, this is the same group that routinely condemns Israel for much more trivial things. And you kind of wonder, the people in Canada, people in, probably elite circles all over the world that talk about the UN being a force for good and this aspirational force. We get strong-armed into signing the UN Compact on Global Migration, saying that, the UN is this great aspirational body that encourages the global community to all work together. And, somehow they have some kind of a moral authority. It's like, what kind of moral authority do you have when you fail to condemn just the most despicable, deadly acts of human cruelty and depravity? It's unfathomable. How can you consider this any kind of global leadership whatsoever? I pointed this out, a couple other people have pointed this out as well. It all goes to speak to, the fact that the fact that Hamas, these Palestinian groups, glorify a man for killing a baby, and they celebrate him for killing a baby. It goes to the deep indoctrination in that society, and there's just deep found hatred for Israelis and the Jewish people more broadly. They get raised to literally just think that Jews are evil and that they're not human. And part of the reason for that is these UN agencies and organizations that operate in Palestine has been deeply corrupted, operate in the Palestinian areas that have been deeply corrupted, including one of the organizations that the Canadian government funds. Just in October, I wrote extensively about this. In October, the Trudeau government recommitted to giving $75 million to an organization called UNRWA. There's well documented, for decades, there's been documentation that this group has been completely infiltrated with Hamas operatives. Basically, Hamas runs a show. They run slates of candidates in these local elections that allow these, UN operatives are part of Hamas. And, they're the same people that are teaching at the schools, they're building the hospitals, and they're using those funds and those resources to prop up Hamas, to support Hamas. It was well documented that they were using UN ambulances to smuggle guns, to move guns into restricted areas, to move terrorists around. They were launching their rockets from UN buildings and UN hospitals, UN schools. The connections with the actual terrorist operatives are very well documented. Not only that, but they use their schools to brainwash and indoctrinate children to hate Jews. There's been a lot of studies on the textbooks that they use, pictures emerging of the play that they do, the summer camps where they reenact deadly scenes, and they basically encourage these kids, and they glorify terrorism. It's just horrible. Stephen Harper, the former Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, pulled funding from this group. Donald Trump followed suit and also pulled funding this year, and that's when Trudeau doubled down on his funding. And so thanks to Trudeau, Canada's giving $75 million to this organization that contributes to this just awful mindset that happens down in Israel. So I think hopefully, maybe, this wicked act of terrorism will let the Canadian government, will leave them thinking. Maybe they'll double think, or they'll think twice about continuing this commitment, or they'll bring in some kind of measure to, allow greater discrepancy over where these funds go. I mean, something should happen of this. I have a column on this today in the Toronto Sun, and I think that it is a good time for Canada to reconsider funding this organization, and especially, after the horrible events, I think Justin Trudeau should really think twice about that. There was two just absolutely appalling stories in the news this week about border security, about the ongoing crisis of illegal immigration into Canada, illegal border crossings that happen mostly along Roxham Road, but then there's also some of the crossings happening over in Emerson, Manitoba. Those are kind of the two main spots. So on the Roxham Road front, first of all, there was a report. This is one of those reports you have to read twice because you just can't believe that it's true. So no, this was not the story I wanted. The first one was the fact that the Trudeau government is now looking to compensate people who live along the Roxham Road area. They want to pay up to $25,000 from the federal government to residents who live near Roxham Road. So apparently this is like, we know that the chaos of illegal immigration is affecting you in your own backyard. So here you're eligible for up to 25 grand a year just to basically look the other way and ignore that there is a mass flow of illegal immigration happening in your own backyard. It's one of those things that the Trudeau government just thinks that they can throw money at a problem, make it go away. So there might be some angry residents saying like, hey, why has our backyard been turned into this like makeshift migrant center where the government is facilitating and processing all these refugee applications and people are just steady flow crossing through. I visited Roxham Road myself back in April, and I mean, it's you can't really call it an unofficial crossing. It's an official crossing. They have CBSA officials, they have border agents, they have this whole apparatus set up, vans, shuttles driving people to both Montreal and Toronto. It's a whole operation. It isn't really an illegal border crossing anymore. It's been turned into a de facto border crossing where they just don't apply the immigration laws. Like a mile down the road, there's an official border crossing. If you're coming from the US into Canada, you can't make an asylum claim. They'll just literally turn you back. But if you walk down the street and cross at Roxham Road, not only do you get in and you can, submit your refugee application, but they give you a ride. You get on a shuttle, they give you a ride to Montreal or Toronto, and then they put you up in government housing. So, it's all just so outrageous that, of course, they're paying $25,000 to people who were there. The next story is this one, which is just even more maddening. This is on the CBC. So, bravo to the CBC for covering this because I wouldn't think they would, but this is an investigative report. Botched handling of gangster refugee claimants exposes Canada's screening weaknesses. No kidding. So this guy crossed the border illegally at Emerson, Manitoba. He's from Somalia. He'd been living in the US for like a decade though. So again, how are you a refugee if you're coming from the United States? You're in a safe country already. Well, this guy just has an absolute storied past, just full on criminal. But during his so the way it works is you submit your application and then you go in front of a refugee judge, an immigration refugee board judge. And basically this guy admitted to being like a hardened gangster, a felon, a serious criminal with just a crazy rap sheet of, gun running and gun possession, drug possession, even, even things much worse like cooperating witness in sex trafficking case. This guy was involved in sex trafficking in Nashville, Tennessee. So, just every kind of crime imaginable, that petty crime and worse that a gangster could get involved in. This guy's been involved in it. And he basically, because he's so honest with his background, the judge decides to let him stay in Canada. This is a quote from the judge. One of the biggest factors that plays in your particular situation is your character. So usually when people are criminals and they sneak into Canada, they enter the country illegally, they try to lie about it. This guy was honest, so he got rewarded by allowing to stay. He made up a claim that he was gay, which his pictures from his cell phone proved otherwise. And basically now he's in Canada and he's committed a bunch more crimes. He committed a bunch of crimes in Winnipeg. He was sent to jail for serious criminality. and then he got released on a cash bond, and he went to Calgary and committed a bunch more crimes. So, what do you expect when you let someone into your country who has no business being a refugee and who openly admits that they are a criminal? I mean, it's just absolutely dumbfounding. Ezra Levant had a really good segment on this yesterday. Ezra, takes a pretty cynical look at this whole thing, and it's a pretty hilarious take. So I encourage you to go over to the Rebel and watch Ezra's report on this, because it's pretty funny, making light of a situation that really isn't that light, but it just shows how naive Canada is, how our system is just completely manipulated. The fears that people have about terrorists and serious criminals just being able to walk right in, manipulate these left-wing judges that are appointed by the Liberal government, just take advantage of everything that we offer, use every appeal available to them. They lawyer up, they manipulate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They just, these are the kind of cases that really just open your eyes to the real, being a realist about our border. That, yeah, we can take the sort of naive liberal position that, Canada should be this land of, hope and opportunity. We should just let everyone in and give everyone a chance. People who've worked in system, people who pay attention, the more you read about this stuff, the more you read these cases, you realize just how many people are just completely bad people that have no intention of contributing anything to Canadian society. And we're just so naive to let a single one of these people into our country when this is how they treat us. So, this is just kind of frustrating. I tweeted about this earlier. Someone was kind of giving me flack for this. They said that I shouldn't give people like this attention. There's a young communist activist, I guess, out of London, Ontario. Sometimes you see a tweet where someone's saying something that's so stupid, you just assume it must be like a parody. So that's what happened this morning when I read this tweet by a woman named Clara Sorrenti. She says, whether you like it or not, Joseph Stalin was one of the greatest anti-fascists in the history of the anti-fascist movement. Under Stalin's command, the Red Army defeated the Nazis and saved several ethnic groups from Nazi extermination. This is a legacy we cannot forget. You read that and you kind of assume it's parody, right? Like, no one can actually be that stupid and that naive and that kind of ideologically one-sided. And then, yeah, you kind of look at her page and she's an actual communist. She's host of a communist YouTube channel, a podcast. She's part of the Communist Party in London, Ontario. And I mean, yeah, in some ways you just kind of ignore people like this because they're so deranged. But at the same time, it's just kind of sad. Like, I can't imagine growing up, going through school, going through high school, going through university or college. I don't know if she went to university or college, but I presume that she would have to come out a Marxist. I don't think that just your average everyday person growing up in London, Ontario just becomes a communist. I think that's something that probably, she had someone who was like a mentor or professor or someone influential in her life who indoctrinated her, or maybe her family's communist. I don't know. But anyway, I can't imagine getting through school, holding those views and never being challenged, never being told, never being handed books to read, never being told about the Holodomor or, any of the other sort of horrible forced famines and tragedies and just the horrific reality of the Soviet Union. I kind of wish that we as a society treated people who are self-confessed communists in the same way, with the same scorn as we treat Nazis. Like, I wish that there was that same kind of like social, just, attitude towards that ideology, because I see them on par. Like, if I met someone who claimed that they were a Nazi or was a self-proclaimed Nazi, it would just be like, okay, I have no time for you. There's no space for you in polite society. I don't even want to entertain your ideas. Just like, go away. That's gross. And yet somehow with communism, there's this creepy like niche for it. And there's just so many Marxist professors on university campuses that don't really explain what happened in the Soviet Union, don't really talk about like Maoist China, or don't really talk about how communism has been tried over and over again in different cultures and different times, different parts of the world, and it's always had the same horrific, devastating conclusion. It's like when I see someone who's unironically a communist, I want to treat them with the same disdain as I would treat someone who is unironically a Nazi. And I think we should. I think we should start treating them in the same way, in the same light. Instead, in Canada, you know, they literally like run for election. They have a slate. They have a political party. They're given, you know, seats sometimes at these all candidates forums. It's just hard to imagine that we take people like that seriously. I just think it's so gross. So the only reason I tweeted at this person today and sort of just told her a different perspective on her ideology was kind of raise awareness that, you know, there are actual communists among us. Young people are embracing it. I remember in the UK a couple months ago, there was an interview with Piers Morgan. He was debating a girl, and she was a student, probably like 20 years old or something. And in the debate, she just kind of lost her temper, and she said, "I'm literally a communist, you idiot." And that became like a catch slogan. And you can buy shirts in the UK, and university students wear them to say, "I'm literally a communist, you idiot." Like, it's something to be proud of. And again, there's just such a lack of, I don't know, like there's just such a weird parallel that there's people who, again, unironically think these ideas are legitimate and interesting and cool, and they don't hear the other side. They don't get challenged. They don't get presented with the counter side. And I think that's one of the truly evil and dangers that happen in our university system. So let's do one more story, and then I've got some exciting news about True North Initiative at the end. So this is kind of more of a lighthearted story here. So you probably saw this, that the CBC will resume playing Baby It's Cold Outside. So I think this is probably cause for celebration, that we should all be happy that political correctness lost and that sanity prevailed here. So you probably saw, I talked about it a bit and we wrote about it, but the CBC, as well as a couple of other radio stations in Canada, announced earlier this month that they weren't going to play the holiday classic Baby It's Cold Outside because of the Me Too movement, and supposedly because it perpetuated rape culture. Well, after overwhelming response from their listeners, the CBC has reversed that decision. Rogers, which is another big media outlet in Canada, is sticking by its decision, but the CBC has folded. So I kind of just find this amusing, because it's like, I mean, the argument is so stupid. The fact that we should censor a song because it doesn't fit today's sensibilities. The song, of course, you know, it's a holiday classic. It's not really a Christmas song. It's more just like a romantic love song from the 1940s in the style, in like the, you know, the great sort of jazz style of that era that we don't really have anymore. And it has this sort of innuendo and the back and forth in the play. And you can tell that both the man and the woman are enjoying themselves, and they're flirting, and he's courting her. And this is all very typical back and forth stuff at the time, you know, before, when music used to, again, use innuendo instead of coming out and flat out saying the things that you feel and believe, which is what modern music does. And so, you know, somehow that because of this innuendo, you could draw conclusions that make you think that the guy's trying to rape the girl, which he's clearly not, that we would ban it. Anyway, this is sort of like today's, not just political correctness, but this sort of weird, like, social justice obsession that we have with trying to ruin things from the past and hold them up to today's high standard, while at the same time having a complete double standard today, because they would never say this kind of stuff about some of the really truly misogynistic lyrics that we see in today's songs, particularly in rap songs. And so it's just amusing, because you can kind of imagine all these like politically correct left-wing elites at CBC coming together and patting themselves on the back, like, you know, we're going to ban this song because it's so wrong, and it talks about, you know, the girl wondering what's in this drink. And, you know, these kind of CBC executives patting themselves on the back and congratulating themselves for being so woke. and then their own listeners, which the CBC, if you don't know, the listeners are overwhelmingly like left-wing or like liberal elites living in cosmopolitan centers. It's not like they represent the sort of mainstream of Canada. The listeners themselves represent the same kind of elite circles. And even among those people, there was still overwhelming listener response saying, what is wrong with you? You're crazy, just play the song, we all like the song. So sanity prevailed, and even the woke CBC has to resume playing the beloved holiday classic, Baby It's Cold Outside. So that's the week in news. It's been a good one. It's been interesting. I want to announce something. I already tweeted this out, but for people on Facebook, we have exciting news out there. Exciting news coming up in 2019 with the True North Initiative. We're making some changes. We're growing. We have some new programs that are coming. And as such, I'm hiring 2 new journalists, 2 reporters. I want them to do investigative reporting, focusing on immigration, national security, to become staff writers for the True North Initiative. So if you're interested, or if you know anyone who's interested, if you want to get more involved in the writing journalism side of True North, please, I encourage you to email me. Send me your resume, send me a couple writing samples or things that you've written, and some story ideas of things that you would want to contribute. So a resume, writing samples, and a couple of story ideas. Email those to me. I'm going to be looking through them, reading through them over the holidays, and then we're going to be hiring 2 new people in the new year. So I'm really excited about that. We're kind of moving more towards doing more and more news, original news, reportive news, investigative news, and trying to get more content out there to tell more of these stories about sort of immigration, national security situation in Canada. So hopefully, there's good people out there, and I would rather hire someone who, is already watching the True North, already sort of familiar with our work and knows what kind of organization we are. I said on Twitter that a journalism degree would be frowned upon. I'm not looking for a professional journalist who went through journalism school. I want someone who thinks for themselves, someone who knows how to write, someone who's a good writer, someone who has a good understanding of world events. I don't want to hire some university student that is some kind of a brainwashed Marxist. So you definitely don't need a journalism degree in order to be a journalist these days, or to work for the True North Initiative. So I will leave it at that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Everybody out there, have a great weekend, and we will be back with more next week. All right, thanks. Take care.